So welcome everybody, and welcome to Configuration Management Who Cares? My name's Lizzie and I'm the Digital Marketing Executive here at AFJ. I'll pass you on to Richard in a moment to begin the presentation, but just to begin with, I'm going to take you through a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy to your email following its completion today. It does mean that you are muted for the duration, so any questions you have, please send those in to us via the chat facility. That should be in your control panel and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And there is also a complimentary infographic for you to download as we go. All right, Rich, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lizzie. So just a little bit more about myself before we get into it. So my name is Richard Josey. I am the lead solutions architect at AFJ Solutions. I've been working in the service management arena for about 20 years, and I've taken a number of roles in that. I've worked in support, I've been a consultant, I've worked as a CSI manager, and I'm also the chair of the BCS Service Management and IT Asset Management Specialist Group. We organise professional development events primarily in the UK. Which has been extremely online in the last couple of years, which people can look up and join into as well as another way of gaining their skills in this area. And I also am a public speaker, represented at Gartner and ITSM and SITS and these kind of things, as well as doing these types of webinars. So enough about me. Let's move on into the agenda for today. So what we're going to be doing to start with is we're going to be looking at what is a CI, what is an asset, what do we mean by this, what are some examples of these types of things. And then we're going to move into who cares about them. So I know we have this sort of slightly combative title to this webinar. And this is a question that you really should be able to answer, and be able to answer in multiple ways. Everything that you want to be looking at in terms of having coverage and scope within configuration management or asset management, you need to understand who cares about these things and why do they care about them. So we're going to be looking at that in a little bit more detail. And then we're going to start looking at some of the principles with some tips and stories on how to go about creating a successful CMDB. And then we're going to look about how you can then utilize that to add value back into your organization. Okay, so that's the agenda. And before we get into the first point of what is a CI, is we're just going to look at a principle here. As I mentioned, I was a CSI manager in my past. So CSI, for those who don't know, is an ITIL term, continuous service improvement. And I found that these two quotes particularly useful in this concept of bringing CSI, and I find this applies very well to configuration and asset management. So that's why I'm raising it here. So the first quote is by a guy called Jan Carlson. He was the CEO of an airline called SAS in the early 80s. And at the beginning of his time there, SAS was down at the bottom of the European airlines by a lot of metrics. And he came up with this: you cannot improve anything by 1,000%, but you can improve 1,000 things by 1%. And he's got a very famous presentation, which you can go and look up, so it's very interesting, which he gave to the entire organization. And in that, they were doing things like looking at what was their target business. So they were targeting business travelers. So doing things like having the newspapers that these people actually want to read as complimentary newspapers that you get when going into business class, having adjoining gates at their hub airports, which was the Kastrup airport in Copenhagen, so that when you arrive and you've got 20 minutes to get from one plane to another, it's not a 20-minute sprint to cover a distance of a half-hour walk to get between your gates. It's literally directly across, so it's about 20 seconds of walking to get from one gate to the other. which of course increases the amount of successful transfers, reduces stress on travelers, means that people actually want to use that for their journey because they know it's going to be a better experience compared to one of the competitors, which means you're now not competing just on price alone. So there's lots of little things that he put together in that in order to turn the airline around. And within 3 years, they won an award for best airline in Europe. Similarly, we have David Brailsford, who was the Olympic team coach for Team GB in the 2012 Olympics, which was hosted in London. And here he's got this quote of, "It's important to understand the aggregation of marginal gains," which is something that he applied throughout the Olympic team's activities. So, you know, we've got a picture here of a cyclist. So this guy is a multi gold medal winner. He's won an awful lot of titles. And obviously he is an amazing athlete in himself. But if you look at his bike, if you look at his clothing, if you look at the aerodynamics of his helmet, his glasses, his body posture, there's lots and lots of small changes that we can be made in this. And all of these optimizations, particularly in sport, can be the difference between coming first and coming last, because the margins between those are actually quite small. And so, I mean, just as one of the examples that he gave, was that one of the things that can really stop people from getting a gold medal when they have the potential for it is becoming ill at the last moment. And he introduced a hand washing regime, which massively reduced the illness rates of athletes, you know, particularly getting ill at the last moment. Obviously, with the pandemic we've all been experiencing for the last couple of years, washing your hands whilst dealing with other people is something that's become much more of a normal day-to-day habit for us. But this is something that he put in and was measured to have good results at the time. And there's a lot of other examples that you can pull out from that. So I don't want to labor the point too much, but the idea of having continuous improvement and being able to make small differences which keep adding in goes into our concepts of value that's coming at the end of the presentation. Okay, so from here, what I'd like to do, difficult to keep a webinar particularly interactive, but I'd like to get us to go into our first poll. So Lizzie, if you could please make the poll live. Okay. So we'll let that run just for a minute. Okay, while we wait, Lizzie, have we had any questions come in on our questions part in the webinar tool?
Not so far. Not so far.
Okay.
You can send those via the chat facility if you'd like to ask Richard anything as we go through. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, Rich.
Okay, thank you very much.
And you should be able to see the results.
Okay, so looking on here, it looks like everybody else can see the poll results except for me. So Lizzie, could you read the poll results out for us, please?
Apologies. So we've got 54% responded with yes, it has reasonable coverage and accuracy. 15% said theirs was yes, it's next to useless, and 31% said no, we are planning to improve. And we had 0% at no improvement plans.
Okay, okay. So, I mean, it's good to see that we've got quite a lot of people who are saying that they've got good CMDBs or reasonable CMDBs, I think is the choice taken there. And it's also clear to see that there is room for improvement to be made here, which is good because if you don't have any room for improvement, there's not really a great need for you to be on this webinar. Yeah, it does kind of dovetail quite nicely into what we have coming up. So I'll just go back to the slides here, and here we can see a couple of metrics which have come out from research been done by Forbes and Gartner, and this is just the latest figures that we were able to get together for this. I've seen Gartner doing stuff going back into the early 2000s, and if anything, the figures have gone up over the years rather than down. And there are various reasons why CMDBs have such a high failure rate. One of the reasons for this is that they're simply not easy, and they require a lot of ongoing effort and focus. And that means that you need to have a focus which is there at a strategic level, at management level, and you know, at a boots on the ground level. All of these things need to come together in order to bring that together to get the success. And it's very, very easy to have a CMDB which is good. And if you just leave it alone, after a couple of years, you'll end up with the answer, we have one, but it's next to useless. And I've seen this happen in a number of organizations, you know, and dealt with an awful lot of people who've been in this situation. And one of the big issues that we get here is about how is it perceived? So what we haven't asked is exactly how accurate is your CMDB, and, you know, what's your scope of it, etc. But if it's perceived to not be good, then it will not be used, and therefore you do not get the value out of it. So scoping is very, very important when it comes to looking at CMDBs. If you try to overscope your CMDB and try and make it too broad and do too many things with it, more than what you're able to handle, what's going to happen is that it's going to degrade the entire thing. And it's far better to have a CMDB which is very limited in scope and extremely accurate and extremely useful for the purposes that it has been scoped for, but not useful for all of the things that it hasn't been scoped for, than it is to try to have something which covers all of the scope and then fails to achieve any of its objectives at all. Okay, so now we're going to look briefly at what is a CI, what is an asset. So I've pulled out here a few things which for me, I find are very, very useful in terms of doing this determination. So firstly, it is something that we can track, and it is something that we have to be able to track in a practical way. If it's not, then there's no point in putting it into the CMDB, and it will just add to that noise, which will detract from its overall value. It needs to be something that has something that is of value in itself. So this could be a financial value, particularly when we're looking at it from an asset perspective. Asset managers tend to be looking at things like, you know, what's the sum total of all of the assets that we have that goes on the balance sheet of the company. So, you know, we've got 1,000 computers and they're all worth £1,000 each, and therefore we have 1,000 times 1,000, and that means something from a financial perspective. But it can also be something that has value because of what it enables and what it creates. So something like a database. A database is not something typically that you can just sell, you know, and reclaim, you know, some kind of capital out of it. But it is something that has value whilst it's being used. So again, we might want to be, you know, including those things in the scoping of our CMDBs. And it needs to be something that we can audit, because if we're recording something and we can't validate that what we've recorded is correct, then we're not going to end up with data that we can trust. And auditing is a key part in terms of maintaining your CMDBs and asset registers, that you've got to be able to find ways of keeping that data up to date. And audit is a part of that. Having some kind of governance and auditing is absolutely key. And from a configuration management perspective, it's something which makes a service run. It's something which provides the ability for us to provide some kind of service that we are providing to users or to customers. And it could be critical in order to making that run. So if it hits these things, then it's something that's a candidate for going in to our register. So when it comes to doing workshops, this is something which I have worked on a lot with, and had lots of interesting debates during. Different people care about different things for different reasons. So by different people, I typically here mean people who have roles within an organization. By things, I mean a thing that you can track, a thing that has value, audit, and makes a service run, and for different reasons. So people might have to do software license compliance. People might have to support, you know, They might be a DBA, for example, so they might need to support databases. They might be a Windows administrator, so they might need to support Windows servers. They might be a network admin, so they might need to support networks. So they might have different reasons for why they want to have an interest in this data. And there can be lots of overlap between these people, and there can be lots of overlap between their needs. And this can create quite a lot of argument because people need to track different attributes of the same thing. So for example, an asset manager might care about the value, but they're not caring about what it's used for. Whereas a service desk manager may not care about how much it actually costs, but they might care about how it's being used within the organization and what might go wrong with it and how are they going to be able to support that. So very important to think about this for each type of CI or asset that you're putting into your CMDB. Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to our next question, which is about job roles. So Lizzie, if you can launch the poll, please.
That should be launched for everyone now. Rich, we've just had a question through as well. Would you like to answer that now as we go through?
Yeah, send it to me.
So, do you link your CMDB to your service catalogue to support activities such as change management?
Very, very interesting question. So, I'm going to go with the consultant's answer at this stage, which is, if anyone knows this, it depends. The answer to any question from a consultant is it depends, and it depends on a number of different factors. And to a certain extent, you do and should. What I'm going to do is I'm going to revisit that question at the end, Lizzie, once we've gone through the slides, and I think that will make a bit more sense then.
Fab. I'm going to close our poll now and share the results.
Okay.
So those follow as asset management, 0%, configuration management, 21%, IT management, 50%, other IT, 29%, and non-IT roles, 0% on this webinar.
Right. Okay. So kind of as we expected that we would be getting IT people within here. And it's all people who are on the sort of service delivery side from what I'm reading from that, which then again affects part of maybe the scoping that we want to do in terms of any decisions that you make within your CMDB. But it's also extremely important for these people to understand that there may be other people outside of their remit who've got an interest in the data. Maybe they've got a need for it. Maybe they don't realize they have a need for it, but by going and talking to them about it, you may be able to start uncovering this. So let's start looking at some of the two sides of the configuration management and the asset management coin. So here on the configuration management side, really what you get from configuration management is benefits where you interact with another process. So the holding of the data itself has some value, but the real key value is where other processes become better or more mature or more efficient or able to provide greater value as a result of what you've got. So here, incident, so I made a note here, key CI information is close to the analyst, which helps to lower resolution times. So just as an example here, we've done implementations with various customers where we've imported all of the laptops and desktops and mobile phone devices into the CMDB. And when you're logging a ticket, you choose the user and you can immediately see what those devices are, and you can go and start seeing details about them. So, you know, Lizzie being in marketing, when she contacts the service desk, she's got a Mac. So that means that you're already into understanding immediately something about the type of issue that she's likely to be having, and how when she's talking, she might just be assuming that you understand when she talks about her computer, she's talking about a Mac and not about a Windows PC. But she might not explicitly state that. So again, we're just helping to shortcut the conversation and to reduce any kind of sort of lack of clarity which might come out from the conversation, and enable it to be a little bit better. Similarly, we can then do things like we can remote control directly onto that device. We can bring up extra information about it. We can see, yeah, maybe it's out of date, etc. So we've got some extra information which helps us to work on that. And again, we might be looking at other things, servers, enterprise applications, etc. Just bringing that information closer to the incident. And then once we start having that availability, we can then log that this incident is about a particular CI. And what that enables us to do is it enables us to go into problem management. And with problem management, again, we can use this data for the same thing as an incident to help us work out what we've got, what's going on, and information that can help us understand what's going on with problems. But we can also look for problems from an ITIL perspective to say, actually, Lizzie's not the only one having a problem with her Mac. All the Mac users seem to be having problems, and it all seems to be linked to the upgrade to the latest macOS version that was released a few weeks ago, for example. And then you can create a problem out of that, start investigating it, and get down to the root cause. And then you can solve that and do exactly what problem management is there for, right? So it gives you that ability to find that. And if you don't have incidents being linked to CIs, that's just one piece of information that you're not able to use in order to create those kind of patterns and start identifying those things. So you start being able to improve your maturity and move problem management from being just purely reactive to being proactive as well. Similarly with change, if you've done relationships there between CIs, you can say, right, I'm going to change this CI. So this could be, for example, changing something on a server. You have to reboot the server. Okay, so what's going to not be available whilst the server reboots? Is there a particular service that is running on? So if you know that, you can then know maybe who are the users who are using that service, and now you can communicate with them as part of the change management process. You can also then understand what's the impact in terms of, do we need to go to the cab? Do we need to just have someone else do a second set of eyes on our change? Is it okay to do it within business hours? Is it not okay to do it within business hours, etc.? You've got that information there to enable those decisions to be made, and in some cases to be able to automatically push the record through the right flow in the process, which again increases your process adherence, process maturity. It also enables you to do a better scheduling. So I certainly remember once, an earlier part in my career, when I was remoting onto a server to do a change, and I had to take a database offline, do a small statement. It took seconds to run, bring the database back online again. And at that moment, my remote connection broke, and I couldn't get back onto the server again. So this entire reporting system was offline because we literally just clicked stop on the database, and no one could get on to hit start again. And that lasted for about 3 or 4 days because someone had made a change to DNS, and that meant the networking to get to it didn't work. But the platform would have stayed up absolutely fine and been able to be carried on being used without the fix that I was putting in. Had we managed to schedule those changes so that they weren't right on top of each other and hadn't happened to happen at exactly the same moment. So that's just one example of where you can use the data in order to improve your processes. There's similarly just things to be mindful of from an asset management perspective, things like regulatory and legal compliance. This might be things like information security. If you're working in banking industry, for example, you might have PCI, which you need to worry about. You might have internal audits and other things that you need to comply with. Similarly, you might be looking to see, ROI on investments, depreciations, and looking to be able to do better things like reusing equipment. So knowing, for example, that you've got lots of laptops which are stuck in a server in a storeroom, and you've got a bunch of people who are starting, and you can look at that data and go, those laptops will be appropriate for these roles. We will simply use those, as opposed to just immediately buying the equipment and having it sent through, because you don't know where your assets are. Okay, so moving on here to who cares? So as you can see from this, we have quite a number of different roles here. So we've got change management, we've got information security, we've got our end users, we've got our service desk, we've got compliance teams, and if you're lucky, the CIO is interested in this as well. And again, having that strategic lead can be quite key. One of the things that I found with this is sometimes CIOs are the drivers for configuration management and CMDB projects and initiatives, and sometimes they need to be brought on board. What I would say is generally, if a lot of these people are not engaged, then you're heading to go into that 80% of failure, because you're going to be missing the people that you need and getting their perspectives and getting their buy-in as part of the journey. Okay, we're going to go a little bit on the attributes. So CIs can have different attributes. Difference between CIs and assets can mean that there are different attributes as well. So some CIs, for example, might be on a network, so they have network-based attributes, others are not, so they don't. Similarly, CPU, these kind of things. And different people can care about them, different things on the same asset and for different reasons. Like, for example, you might care about how much CPU power you have on a machine because you're wanting to make sure that you've got enough capacity to be able to provide a service that you want to provide. Another reason you might be wanting to do it is because it's a per core license, and therefore you care about the cost, but you don't actually care if it's got enough power to do the job that it's doing, depending on your function. And this tends to fit into three main groups: finance, information security, and operations. So finance tend to be looking at sort of rules and regulations. Information security are generally about risk, and operations are generally about keeping the services running, keeping the lights on, as we like to say. And then that means that you care about different things. So like, for example, just taking from the middle there, patch levels, information security may have policies that say, you know, all high advisory level patches need to be put onto all of our machines within 2 weeks of them being released by the vendor. It might be the responsibility of the operations people to get it on there, but their general focus will tend to be much more on, am I keeping the lights on, rather than did I hit that particular goal? So, you might be looking at it for different reasons, but you also might have different responsibilities in there, and having an understanding between those really, really helps to communicate to people, why is it that you're doing something? If you don't know why you should be doing something and nobody notices when you stop, then you tend to stay stopped. And that's when things which are good ideas tend to fall by the wayside and get out of practice. And that's a very, very key part about configuration management, is about making sure we have the right kind of culture. So our basis is our architecture. Okay. Now, the way I tend to see this is like a hub and spoke arrangement, where your CMDB, which is normally hosted inside your ITSM tool, is your hub, and other things sit around it. And so we can see in here, we've got things like mobility, we can have automation tools. We've got an asset register, which in this diagram is distinct and separate from the CMDB. Some organizations will do that, that's perfectly valid. Others will want to have them joined together. Again, you've got this whole purpose of who are the stakeholders, what do they care about, and what's the best way of getting out to them. And sometimes having that in separate tools is better. We can have discovery tools which feed into that. We can have desktop and server management tools, some of which do part of the discovery themselves or do the discovery themselves. They can feed in and maybe take data out as well. And I've put distinctly off to the left there spreadsheets, quite deliberately. Sometimes they will be conjoined, but often they will be separate. And it's very key to understand that spreadsheets here are a perfectly legitimate part of your overall architecture. It's often where data starts. It's the easiest thing to start tracking something in, like now. So if you're given the task of putting a list of things together, you load up Excel, you start putting in data, you create a few columns, and there you are. You're already starting to track these things. And then once you get to a certain stage, you start finding that, okay, now the data is only in the spreadsheet. It doesn't really integrate with any of these other tools very well. Other people can't necessarily see it easily. You can have issues of multiple versions of spreadsheets being in different locations and all of this kind of stuff. So having a centralized repository may make sense, but it's a continuation of the maturity. And starting with spreadsheets isn't a bad thing. And sometimes choosing to stay with spreadsheets for certain types of data may be the most appropriate thing to do, at least for the moment. And it's certainly better to keep the data out of the CMDB until it is ready to come in. Again, it's going back to that concept that I was talking about earlier about having noise and quality within there. If the quality of your CMDB drops too low, it rubbishes the entire thing and people think that it becomes useless. Okay. So how do we make sure our CMDBs are successful? So here, I'm going to start with a few principles here. So lean, I make absolutely no profession to be an expert in lean, but I do like some of the ideas in it, and I like to take some of the principles from it. The idea behind lean is basically to make sure that you have all of the right things in the right places at the right moment for somebody or something to be able to do a task and to create the right output from that task. And for there to be the minimum number of blockers in the way, the minimum amount of what in lean is called waste, which can be anything from actual kind of physical waste, wasted time, wasted effort, or things sitting there doing nothing when they could be able to proceed. And what I like with this kind of way of thinking is it's trying to bring everything down and cut out what are all the things that we don't need. So quite often people think, right, well, can I have an extra field in my CMDB? Well, yes, you can. Does it cost me anything? Well, license-wise, normally no. You know, you can just stick an extra column on your spreadsheet as well. But if you've got 1,000 rows, you've now got 1,000 data points. If you have 10,000 rows, you have 10,000 data points. If you've added in 10 fields, you've now got 100,000 data points. If you don't need these because they're not producing the kind of value, you've got 100,000 data points which you're trying to manage, and it's not producing the value that you need. So that kind of way of thinking of being quite strong in terms of trimming off, shall we say, the sides and the nice to haves. And once you're ready with what you've got, you can then think about maybe adding something to it. So that's a very useful principle. The vision. Why are you having a CMDB? What is the purpose for your configuration management process? If you can't answer that question, you can't communicate it within the organization, and you can't get people to get on board with it. It's very, very important to have a clear vision. Again, what I was saying earlier about scoping, if you can bring your scoping down to something which is sort of correct, pertinent, and achievable, then you can get people to come on board. And again, you're not going to get the culture side of things right if you don't have that vision. And using evidence-based decisions is very, very useful. Again, when I've been doing workshops, I've seen lots of discussions where people have gone, right, well, we have to have this thing because it's absolutely essential. And then you say, do you have that data at the moment? Well, no, we don't, but we need to have it. Okay. Why? Well, it'd be good to have in the future. Is it causing any problems you not having it at the moment? No. Okay, so we don't actually have the evidence to say we need to go and collect the data and we need to manage it and we need to put this effort onto this group of people because we can't justify it. If we can say, for example, we've had 5 major incidents in the last 2 months, 3 months, which has cost the company, you know, 1 million in revenue, 10 million in revenue. And if we had a better CMDB, we could have avoided some of that, or we could have reduced some of those costs. Now we've got evidence to say, actually, this is going to save us money. So being able to utilize that in your way of thinking, and it can be quite difficult to do this sometimes. But again, it's kind of having this focused thinking and resource being put against this area that enables you to be able to start thinking about what evidence you need to collect. So another key sort of principle here is an iterative principle. So I found it very, very useful to do this in stages. If you try to create one big, huge CMDB, and I've seen organizations working on this where they spend like 1-2 years coming up with the definition of what the CMD is going to be, and then they spend another 2 years, you know, trying to build it and test it and get everything in place. And you think, that's 4 years. You haven't actually achieved anything yet. If you could have just got the laptops in say month 1, month 2, and then a couple of months later, you went and did something else, etc. So we've done some implementations. So for example, I had a client who came to me and said, we need to get the end user devices into our CMDB. And we need to do that within the next couple of months because of various reasons that they had. So, okay, that's fine. Very limited scope. We can do that. Then afterwards, we can look at things like servers, network devices. We can start looking at integrations with other tools, enrich some of that data with some extra information, which is available there, but it's not part of goal number 1. So we start with putting in the process, hitting goal number 1, we move on to goal number 2. Getting a balance between focusing and paralyzing. So focusing on particular topics and having multiple groups working on different topics at the same time so we can move forward faster from a calendar perspective. And again, making sure all of these iterations are really focused on business needs and understanding what we're going to get out of them. So how do we kind of keep this going and keep improvement? So this is something I certainly found when I was a CSI manager, dedicated resources. If you do not dedicate resources and you don't make it clear how you're doing that, what you'll find is it stays as a nice to have. And that becomes a real challenge. It means that from a cultural perspective, you don't get people taking it seriously, and you're not getting you know, the embeddedness in people's habits. Sometimes you need to start with dedicating resources to get something going, and then you need to keep a lower level to keep it going, but you need to make sure you've still got that lower level dedicated and you don't get distracted, shall we say, by the day-to-day, which can be very, very easy to do when you don't have someone who's got a clear definition of having responsibility. So it's good to see there's quite a number of people on the call who've got configuration management as a job role. For those of you who are IT managers, I know sometimes you need to wear multiple hats, but making sure someone who's got at least enough time, you know, maybe it's just 1/5 of their job to be the configuration manager, so they can come back to it and whilst, you know, in between doing other things. And what you're looking for overall is to have a culture of this is the way that we do things. We maintain things, we follow process, we understand what the benefits are for it, and we all like this, right? If you can get that, then you've really in a good place and you're able to maintain your data well and able to keep getting value out of it. And you can avoid going into the position where you have a CMDB where the data is not maintained anymore, so nobody uses it, and we get some of the answers we had earlier that we have a CMDB, but it's not particularly useful. Okay, making it stick. So this is absolutely critical. Once we've got the right structure in place for the CMDB, we understand who the stakeholders are, etc. We've got the buy-in. We go, we have some processes, we work out what they are, we document them, we train people, we get everything up and going. How do we keep it after that? So governance is a key thing, and it goes back to what I said about having dedicated resources. If you are measuring something, it shows that you care. Quantum physics teaches us that if you measure something, it changes. You know, and this kind of quantum effect does seem to work in this scenario as well. Is, you know, if I've got to report at the end of every month how many laptops we have, how many laptops do we have which have got the latest version of Windows on, how many laptops do we have which are not fully patched up to date, and I need to report that to the CIO. I'm not going to turn up to many meetings where I'm not producing the right kind of information, particularly if I have a CIO who's not going to accept excuses for particularly long, right? So just simply the act of measuring will bring along a whole load of work that goes behind that in order to be able to produce that and to be able to produce it in a reliable way, in a way that can be trusted. So, and this can be done for any type of data. And a key thing to this is having ownership over the data. So if you've got data owners, and then you have, so we say kind of a governance gatekeeper, this can be a configuration manager who is making sure that the data owners are doing their things, which can be just simply checking the data, making sure that it's up to date, you know, which could be on a quarterly basis, it could be a 6-monthly basis, it could be a yearly basis. It all depends on your own audit cycles. How important is it, and what are you actually able to handle? And also, again, this value challenge, right? What you don't want to be is in that situation where you have 80% of failed CMDBs, because if your CMDB is going to completely fail, you might as well not bother doing it at all in the first place. Tracking satisfaction is another thing that you can do here as part of the governance in order to be able to understand how well this is working. A SACA manager that I used to work with would measure as his main metric for CMDB on an annual basis how accurate is the CMDB. He would push this out to all of the people who had some kind of usage and contact with the CMDB, and they could provide any figure that they liked back. It was completely unscientific. It was all based on perception. And what he found was that by doing improvements year on year, the figure went upwards because people would start to perceive it as being better as the improvements came in. He did other measurements as well, like he would do baselining, and then he would do validation of a percentage of the baseline data, and then seeing how much that compared to the baseline in terms of accuracy and generating a figure from that. So that had more science and rigor around it. But the satisfaction part was absolutely key, because if you've got a brilliant database with amazing data in it that can be used to do fantastic things with, but people don't care about it, then they're not going to use it. Whereas if they see the value in it and they can start extracting value from it themselves, they will go in and start doing that. So again, going with the iterative process, feedback is really, really important. So celebrating achievements and reiterating that you have made those achievements. Hey, we went live with CMDB with, this particular part here. We've now added this extra data in. For example, we could have added in big screen monitors that we have around the place. Some of our customers do that, meeting rooms and reception areas and things like this, wall boards, this type of stuff. We've now added them into the CMDB. Now that makes it easier for us to be able to do the following activities. Really key thing here is rewarding positive behaviors. And it's one of those things that you cannot maintain data on a large scale and say, you're the configuration manager, it's your job to maintain 20 million data points. It's just not possible for one human being to do it. It needs to be something which is done by the tribe. One organization that I worked with, the way that they did it, it's a little bit quirky, worked very well with their culture. They had the configuration management troll. We've moved forward. This is where we were. This is where we were going. This is where we're now going, etc. And identifying what challenges you've hit along the way and what successes you've had. And that's very useful with vision, is to kind of show at least sort of say the last couple of stages once you're on a journey, as well as where we are going. Like, this has been really great. This didn't work so well, and now we're doing this. Okay, so how do we bring the people? It needs to be relevant for each role. So go through your staker lists and work out what is relevant to them and why it is relevant to them and why should they care, because some will be on board already, others will not. And then look at their personal benefits. How do I gain? If you want me to put data into a system and make sure that when it changes, I should go back into that system and change the data, what am I going to get out of it? If you can give me something that makes my job easier, I've now got a personal incentive to go and do that. So one example I had from a number of years ago was we had a change management manager who was putting in a change process, and we had people who were starting to engage with this change process, and they had an issue where they were doing things like starting services and restarting servers on machines which had monitoring on them. And then the monitoring systems would go into the NOC, and they would go absolutely mad because they had a P1 incident, and then it turned out someone was just doing a change and they just restarted something and everything was fine and there wasn't an issue, but nobody told them that it was going to happen. So they spent like 20 minutes desperately trying to work out what was going on. And all they needed to do was put the machine into monitoring mode. So they started doing that, and then sometimes they forget to take it back out when they finish their change. So then, like, after 2-3 days, the system would go down, And then the business senior leaders would go absolutely ballistic because they'd been told that monitoring had been put in place and this will never ever happen again, and yet it did. So they had this kind of challenge in their place, and so the staff came to the change manager and said, could we automatically get our servers to go in and out of monitoring mode if we log a change? And she said, yeah, I think we can. And we went and we built it and we got it to do that. So, you know, when you logged your change, you know, if you said it's from 6 o'clock in the evening till 10 o'clock at night, you knew it would go in at 6. You could go on, do whatever you liked. And at 10 o'clock at night, automatically go back into live monitoring. And now suddenly everybody wanted to log a change for any server change that they were making, because it meant that their jobs were now easier. It was easier to log a change than it was to do it in the old way. So that's personal benefits. Again, translating vision from it's the corporate vision, it's management speak, to how does this actually apply to me is very, very important. And having people who are outside of the leading group who will champion your cause. I mean, this is typical organizational change management, but this is very much what we need to be looking at when we're trying to implement configuration management. And then again, the point I made earlier about governance. Big Brother is watching. So I'm not suggesting we go quite as far as dystopian world in which Big Brother was brought to us in 1984. But, you know, the idea that you're doing something, you know, and again, what I was saying about, you know, praising people and giving them feedback, you know, if your manager comes along and says, yeah, I see you did all of these things this week, that's really great. Thank you very much. Go and have a great weekend. That helps you to feel good about what you're doing, but it also shows you that this person is actually caring and they are paying attention. And if next week you just go, oh, I can't be bothered, they might come to you at the end of the week and say, you know, this week we need to have a little bit of a chat because I don't want that to happen again. And that just kind of helps to flow to, you know, avoid getting that and to help build with the culture that you're looking to achieve. So again, you need to be careful with that in terms of the levels of governance and the amount of effort that you put into that. You need to be realistic about these things because you can only track so much. And it's very, very easy in a workshop to try to boil the ocean, as we sometimes say, to try to go too far, to try to overscope. And it can be very easy from a governance perspective to say, those people over there have to do this thing because that's the right thing to be done, which, shall we say, might be technically correct, but it's not necessarily going to bring those people on side. So you need to, you know, so we say, use it as a tool, but not as your only tool. Okay, so just some final words here on adding value. So firstly here, starting with design, it's the absolute fundamentals in an awful lot of things that we do within IT, and CMDB is absolutely no exception to that. Absolutely key part of that is getting the scoping for that right, and making a design which is going to scale for what you need and be manageable. Automation, where can we bring in automation that helps to bring extra value? Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier was about using things like remote control. Other things can be, you know, say automatically putting servers in and out of a maintenance mode. And there can be other things that we can do as well, because once we've got the configuration management data off of incidents, we can do lots of things. We can do things like restart services. We can do things like reboot machines. We can do things like gather the logs that are on that machine and bring them straight down to the analyst. There's lots of things that we can do there, which can help to improve the flow through a process. So one example is one of our customers has got a CMDB, which has got several monitoring tools, which are connecting to it and saying, here's an issue, here's an issue, here's an issue. And every single CI has got a team which owns it. So the ticket goes directly to that team. So if it's networking, it goes to the network teams, it goes to the right server teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it keeps all of these tickets away from the service desk because the system knows how to automatically route these problems. And that just increases the efficiency of that particular process. Similarly, you can use automation tools to drive stuff out into the organization, creating VMs, for example. So, I mean, we use a variety of tools for automation. And AFJ, we've partnered with Calvarian, which is an automation tool, which is something you can use to make a sort of a visual PowerShell, which enables you to go into the infrastructure, and it can be used to rely on that CMDB data quite significantly. Similarly, another topic to think about is mobility. Where do you need to do your asset tracking? Do you need to be able to use mobile devices, for example, to go around and to do audits, you know, or to update and maintain your CMDB? And if it does, how are you going to be able to do that? So again, we have a mobile tool which is in that space, but it's not the only solution here. And again, how are you going to grow? How is your CMDB going to grow with you over time? Is it something that's going to help to enable you to have company growth? Is it going to be something that you can expand upon? Again, this iterative approach. You know, these are the plans and sort of questions we need to be asking ourselves. So, with that, Lizzie, I think we've got most of the way through our time here. Let me just do a quick check, and we should have some time left in order to take some questions. So, hopefully, people have found that useful. And have we had some questions come in?
Yeah, Rich, so we've got a couple in. I'll start with this one. So in your experience, how do most businesses collect their asset information and get this into their ITSM system?
Okay, so most organizations will use a combination of manual automated methods. Generally, if it is on the network, you can automate it. Or if you have another tool which is appropriate, then you can automate it. But as a general rule, I found if it's on the network, you can automate it. So for all devices which are not, then you tend to go towards manual methods. So like the example I gave of having big screens, for example, which get installed, they might be kind of network connected, but they're often not done in a way where you get full details about them. So you might want to manage that, but particularly things like locations and stuff like that, your only options are to use some kind of manual methods in most scenarios. Sometimes you can use things like IP mapping to say, if it's got this IP, it must be inside this building because that's how our network is structured. And you can do that mapping and give it locations directly off of that.
Okay, great. And this second one we've had in says, we're struggling to track assets as we expand. How do people best track their assets?
Very good question. So, so the two key things there is, one is, again, where you can automate that tracking, do it. The second is to have a very good understanding as to what the process is, and to, again, using that lean principle, keep it as trim as possible, and then build it into your other processes. So like, for example, I have a laptop. It's at the service desk, we give it to a user. At the point where it's handed over, we have a service request where it's been dealt with as a part of that, and the updating of the CMDB data is being done as a part of that service request. When somebody leaves or moves role or needs to have a laptop change, these should all be tickets in the system. And inside those processes, the updating of that data should be baked into that. And again, that then feeds into the governance that I was talking about earlier, the checking to make sure, is this actually happening as a part of those processes?
Okay, great. And did we want to revisit our earlier question?
Yes, so I'll let you reread it out to me. I remember it's something to do with CIs and service catalog.
Yeah, so do you link your CMDB to your service catalog to support activities such as change management?
So the way I normally perceive the concept of a service catalog is more around service requests than change management. But the service level of a service catalog is normally involved in change management. So yes, in terms of that linking, if you want to understand impact analysis, then yeah, that's really helpful, where you have the relationships between the CIs and the services. But the challenge with that is, again, it's this maintenance of data. And I mean, I've seen some organizations which have got, you know, well over 100 million connections between CIs in their database. And this is not something that you can handle without appropriate tooling. So again, scoping for that, if you're going to do it manually, you can do it manually, and I have seen organizations do that, but you need to be clear about what you want, what you need to do, and how many services you're actually going to do that for. So a lot of organizations will choose, like, for example, these are our top 10 services, you know. If some service goes down, who's the person who's most senior in the organization to shout at you about it, right? If it's the CEO, it might be an idea to do a service model for that. If it's several layers below that, then you might think, well, now we're getting into the point where there's too many layers, you know, too much work in order to maintain those kind of relationships. So I think that's what the question was asking about, but my apologies if it wasn't. So do feel free to clarify in the questions if I've missed the point on any of these.
Okay, so that's the end of the questions that we've had in. If you did want to ask anything, you can email it across and I'll share with Richard and we'll get back to you with any specific questions you might have. But yeah, we're about on time. So I'd like to thank you all for attending today and have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.